Sea Grant does a great job of coordinating different groups together. So responders stay with responders, government people stay with government, academia typically stays with academia. So this gives us an opportunity to all come together to share our experiences and learn from one another. And trust me, there's a lot to learn. And we found that after many oil spills, we never stop learning. So thanks to Sea Grant for bringing this type of stuff together. I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the challenges to cleaning wetlands. And I know that Larissa covered some of my stuff in her pre-slides, and I'm sure I will be covering some of the next speaker's stuff too. So if you see as the day goes on duplication, it's because it's important. So that's the take-home message. If you hear it more than once, and I see heads nodding from the professors, if I say it more than once, it's probably on the test, right? So I guess no good discussion about dealing with the challenges of cleanup would be had without talking about who the response players are. So typically in a response you'd be dealing with so we have various federal players. I'm sure you're familiar with quite a number of them. Being a Louisiana employee, we have a couple of players, but I'm sure this is pretty standard across the Gulf Coast. Each state is going to have their own representative showing up at the incident command. Of course, we need our oil spill response organizations. Our OSROs, as we call them, are the best in the world here locally in the Gulf Coast, and particularly in Louisiana. And we think it's that because they get so much practice. So they are best in the world. They work quite frequently. But a new addition to response players are NGOs and academia community. So here to this point, most of the spill responses have been devoid of some of the volunteer groups, have been particularly devoid of scientists from the academia world. So that's something we would like to change as we grow as an organization and grow an incident command. We can garner very valuable information from all of these groups. All right, so kind of a short discussion on the regulatory framework, but these are kind of the regulations of response. So these are the laws that govern how we respond, when we have to respond, and what that response should look like. So the National Response Framework is basically a comprehensive approach to incident management. It requires the use of ICS, an incident command structure, requires area contingency plans, which in the New Orleans area and coastal Louisiana, we have spent thousands of man-hours recreating from scratch geographic response plans. Our area contingency plans are top-notch, but they have to constantly be updated because our environment changes, both politically and from a geomorphology characteristics. So our wetlands are sinking, they're shrinking, they're being washed away by waves. So an area that you had as a high priority target for cleanup may not be there anymore. So when you go back, there's no reason to put boom around something that's no longer above the surface of the water. But in a nutshell, this framework provides an effective interaction between all the federal, state, local government, tribal, private sector, and other non-governmental entities. So it's a really good program and has proved quite beneficial to handling response in the Gulf Coast. So here's briefly the ICS structure. Usually is formed by the federal government. You'll have a state government representative and then a responsible government or responsible party representative. So in typical command system functions, the federal government is the leader. They have a 51% say in what happens with the response. So if the RP balks at putting out boom, feds say you put boom out or we're taking it over. So if the federal government takes over, then the RP has lost their ability to control costs. So it's very likely that the responsible party is going to want to make sure that the federal and state governments are very happy with their response. So these would be kind of a typical role that as a Louisiana representative that where we would be in incident command. We would serve as the state on-scene coordinator. We may serve as a planning section chief. Typically we would be a technical specialist, a scientist working very closely with the NOAA SSC to inform both of the commanders, make sure that they're covering all the bases and science is working for them instead of working against them in the court of public opinion. So one of the most important roles that we do serve would be under the planning unit, in the environmental unit, and the SCAT units. Those, the SCAT is basically the eyes and ears of your response. But the planning unit develops the mitigation plan. The environmental unit ensures that that plan is ecologically sound. The SCAT team basically is the eyes and ears of the response. They're the people that go out to ensure that the plan's being enacted and it's not doing more harm than good. So unfortunately, we were supposed to have a SCAT training course coming up this week, but it had to be canceled because of hurricane response. So all of the instructors were dealing with hurricane response in their particular areas, so look for a new course to come out in the spring. If you haven't been to that, it's a good course to attend. All right, so the operations unit actually enacts that plan. They're the ones that go out and actually boots on the ground get it done. Let's talk a little bit about wetlands. So I know I'm running short on time, but oil spill cleanup in wetlands. So what are wetlands? They are a complex group of habitats. And it could be swamps, salt marshes, river marshes, bayous, bogs. There can be a highly variable energy setting, which means it's constantly being attacked by wind and waves or high currents from flow or from tidal conditions. We found that in a high energy setting, the best course of action is natural recovery. So if we go in and try to affect that with boots on the ground and shovels and skimmers and things, it's really ineffective. We would want to kind of stand back and put in protective measures, collection measures, and let the current work for us instead of against us. So it's the low energy settings that usually require us to go in and physically do something. But if you're one of these incident command players and you have a choice, it's an intermittent setting, maybe the best thing to do is nothing. So hey, at the end of the day, sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. Stand back, let Mother Nature heal itself, put up some protective measures so wildlife is not affected, drinking water sources are not affected, swimming areas are not affected, but it's okay to let Mother Nature heal herself. She'll do it if we get out of the way. This is an interesting contraption. This is called an aquatic weed harvester. And I know Louisiana has a lot of water hyacinth, and this stuff is like a magnet for oil. So if oil gets into aquatic vegetation like this, ask your Osro to bring this thing out. So we're killing two birds with one stone. We're getting rid of a noxious aquatic pest, and we're picking up oil at the same time. So that's a win-win for the environment. All right, some of the factors affecting the impact of oil on marshes. So we have the oil type, obviously, the extent of the contamination of the vegetation, the degree, the amount of oiling that gets into the soils. And I guess the key here is the soils. A little bit of oil on the grass is going to slough off as it grows. The sheath of grass that falls off in a strange way becomes a nutrient for regrowth of more grass. Mother Nature heals herself. If we go in and smother that grass, put boom all over it, trample all over it, put boardwalks on top of it, it dies. So for example, if you put your welcome mat in your yard, if you put it in the middle of your front yard and leave it there for a week, you come back, your grass has a rectangular shape of brown, yellow, dead grass. Same thing happens in the marsh. So If you can keep it from coating, some of these pictures, it's a little hard to see, but this vegetation is just completely coated. The wind, the waves have pushed back on it. It's laid back. The chance of recovery here is not good. So we would not want to make that worse. But some of the other factors that impact would be the time of the year of the spill. So in the summer, I know in Louisiana, I'm sure the Gulf Coast is the same way, we have a plethora of bacteria, natural bacteria that would love to eat them some oil. If we get out of the way, it's going to eat as much oil as it can on a daily basis. We don't need to purchase a bunch of oil spill eater tube. Sorry, salesman. We have our own natural bacteria that's ready to go. So if we can get out of the way, let it eat, Mother Nature will heal itself. In the winter, not quite the same. Now, Louisiana winter is not quite like it is in Canada, but it does get a little cooler here in the winter, and it does minimize that bacteria's ability to reproduce, and it's not quite as active. So winter is a little tougher to deal with, but different species have different sensitivities to oiling. So those are all factors, and this is the big one, and I'm sure this is going to be talked about a lot in the next NERDA talk, but damage done by the response is still damage, injury done to the marsh. So we want to minimize that from a response perspective as much as we can. All right, so there are environmental trade-offs you have to think about as a responder. So you've got the effect of the oil on the marsh versus the effect of the cleanup in the marsh. So these are some things you have to look at. So you've got habitat that's oiled, so you send in a herd of people to trample it down and wipe it with an absorbent pad. That's retarded. Who would do something like that? But it happens every day. So we have documented proof that they have people wipe each stem of grass with an absorbent pad. So who would think to do something like that? But anyway, that's what we're trying to avoid, is doing more harm than good. So we know the oil is toxic. We know the oil does harm. We've seen the herd of responders going in doing the damage. So we want to make sure that we're not doing more harm than good. Remember that, it's on the test. Do no more harm than good. So basically, making decisions about how to best respond to oiled marshes is based on assessing the effect of the oil versus what the cleanup is going to do to the marsh. So if you're destroying it to saving it, what have we done? Nothing. So here's the takeaway. Keep the oil out of the soil. So if you're going to go into a marsh platform, ensure that there's one way in, one way out. Use of boardwalks. We're okay with giving up a little bit, a 4x8 sheet of plywood. Run a walkway for them to get in and get to the back, that marsh pond that's impacted back there. Find them a way to get in, but make sure they do. We'll give up that one stretch, but I don't want them traipsing in 7 different ways. They are destroying it. They're pushing it down into the soil, and this is what you come out with. This is not going to recover. So you push it down in the soil. You're killing the vegetation at its base, its roots. It will not recover. Done. All right, so there's also seasonal effects of spills in marshes. So oiling in the winter, it's the dormant season. Basically the grasses have coalesced. All the juices have flown into the roots. They're kind of almost protected from being impacted by great amounts of oiling. So that's the least impact. Oiling in the growing season, greatest impact. Oiled plants rarely flower. Oiled flowers do not produce seeds. You see where I'm going with this. So it gets worse and worse. So not only do you have immediate impact, but you have next season impacts. You got 5 years from now impact. So I know in Louisiana we can't afford to lose a marsh platform, because when we come back, we've lost 5 feet. Next year, the grasses didn't come back. All right, we've lost 15 feet. So you expand that across 2,000 miles of shoreline, it adds up quick. So losing a football field of soil and vegetated marsh every 15 minutes is a reality. All right, so response methods for marshes. Number 1, natural recovery. This is the best for us. So if you can do it, this is the best. So line the area with Sorbent Boom, protect it with containment boom from being impacted more, allow the natural ebb and flow of tide to bring that material out to you, collect it with sorbents. If you have to, we could use some flushing type things, but we certainly wouldn't want to hit it with high pressure, high volume water, but maybe low pressure, could even be high volume, but if it's low pressure, you're not blasting it down into the mud, you're just sheet flowing it to push it out of the vegetation into a containment and recovery structure. Good stuff. Other options, and you've got surface washing agents. Those actually keep, or they'll knock the oil off the vegetation and allow it to be released back into the water, and you can collect it. Manual removal, vegetation cutting, in situ burning, all are really good methods for dealing with oil spills in marsh environments. We just have to make sure that it's the right technique at the right time in the right place. Natural recovery is the best. It's the least habitat impact for small amounts of oil, oil that's exposed to waves, currents, high tide ranges, and oiling that's during the growing season. So really what you would have to look at here would be the timing of habitat use by wildlife or animals. So if you wanted to leave some oil in a prime duck marsh and you're in November, that's going to be a problem, because we've got migratory waterfowl flooding down in there, and they're going to be being oiled. Migratory species oiled is a problem. So that's something that we'd have to take into consideration as incident commanders is maybe we don't have time for natural recovery. We're going to have to augment that some to make sure that it's safe for wildlife. So use of sorbents in the marshes, pretty much this is all we have. So if we're not going to come up with some out-of-the-box alternative strategy that needs Regional Response Team 6 approval, all we got is sorbents. That's all we got. So this oil absorbents work, and there are a variety of ones that will work, but if oil is up in a situation like this, sorbents aren't working in that. Unless these guys come in and step on them and shove it down into the soil, there's nothing adhering to those donuts. So this would be best trying another type of remediation. The point of the picture is this doesn't work. But so I think we have to look at care as needed during placement and recovery to make sure that boom is not ending up on top of the marsh and smothering it, similar to my example of the welcome mat. So if you've got a whole string of boom that's laid up in the marsh, it's killing the grass and not protecting it. But at the end of the day, when you run out of containment boom, you got some sorbent boom left, it does not work as containment. So your sorbent boom is not going to prevent any of this oil from reaching the shore. It may absorb some of it, but it's sorbent boom, not containment boom. All right, so the improper deployment of sorbent, this is kind of what we talked about, but this stuff all up in the grass, number one, it's not on the water's edge, so it's not in impact with any of the oil to absorb, but it's also doing more harm by crushing the vegetation than it's doing good. So we want to make sure that, especially in areas that have a high tidal range, that our OSROs are monitoring this on a daily basis, and they're moving that structure, the containment structure, up when the tide's high, and they're falling it back when the tide's low to make sure that it's effective and it's performing well for us. Vegetation cutting in marshes. This is another option. I know in Louisiana we have seen as very effective, especially in marshes that are dominated by species that are not native to Louisiana, specifically roseau cane. We are okay with cutting out some roseau cane patches to allow access to get back behind it, push oil out. We've been shown to have good success with that. But there are things that you need to consider, I guess, before your first option is not to cut the vegetation down. So you'd want to look at other options before that, but it is an option for us. So some considerations would be looking at when the oil would become sticky or tacky and no longer a threat to wildlife. So as a raccoon walks through the marsh, it's rubbing off on its fur. So the animal's constantly preening itself, licking its arm, licking its fur. It's getting jesting in its mouth. Animals are perishing because of this. So this may be an example where cutting may be in order. And I'm given the 3-minute sign, so I'm rolling. So here is a kind of an interesting display on cutting in the Delta National Wildlife Refuge. So we had a spill in this area. We cut lanes to access it in '93. In '98, these are the two little islands you can't even tell it happened. 2004, 6 years later, totally gone. The cane head completely recovered. Roseau cane's very resilient, but it's invasive. So we're not as concerned with it as we are some of the other stuff. So some of the alternative strategies that we talked about, in situ burning, use of applying loose sorbents, things like that, would require a regional response team 6 approval. I don't think I have time to do this or that. All right, so I guess the bottom line is to avoid techniques that will harm more than help. And in this particular case, this was after BP. They wanted to put up these impenetrable sheets of fabric along these marsh platforms. And I know that I personally disagreed with this because there's no tidal flow. So the basis of our marshes and why we're such a dynamic fisheries is the crustaceans, the small fry get to come and go out of this marsh. That's where they live. So we basically shut that off. So it didn't get oiled, but it was completely neutered because it was no longer viable as a fish hatchery. This is not the way to go. So sometimes thinking out of the box, while good, is still not the right thing to do. All right, so impact of cleanup. These are the important ones. So destruction of the root systems by trampling. Number one, you've heard of contractors go stomping through oil, pushing it down into the roots. We're going to have injury. So they mix the oil deeper into the soils. It slows its weathering. Once it gets under the ground, there's no more oxygen available for it, so its decomposition is extremely slow in the measure of decades as opposed to weeks of being on the surface. So they also are in there with shovels scraping out the suitable topsoil for regrowth is now in a bag in a landfill somewhere. They're smothering the vegetation by soils that they've disturbed being moved around by ebb and flows of tides. And they've also made the interior of the plant available for exposure to toxic substances in the oil. So there you go. Anybody know why these trees may be dead behind this oil heater, line heater platform? I'll buy you a cup of coffee if anyone knows. It's a produced water spill. So who would think to walk back there and see that? But we drove by, I was like, man, I wonder why all those trees are dead. So while oil spills are horrible, produced water spills are much, much worse. So they are extremely toxic, in the range of 200 parts per thousand salinity. Freshwater systems, it's devastating. There are radium-226 in there, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So don't forget about produced water. So booms don't work on water, so how are we going to clean up water? But that's another factor that may want to consider a longer discussion on. But that's all I have.